Lewis Britton and his 84-year-old mother lived in a flat at 16 Macleay Street, Potts Point, Sydney. In the building next door at number 18, called the Garrick, lived his sister, Jeanette Wicks, also known as Jean. Due to this living arrangement, Jean would eat meals with her family. So at about 8 p.m, it was with some concern in his mind that Lewis ventured out to see why Jeanette had not come home for dinner, and why there was no answer when he phoned the kiosk where she worked. It was Wednesday, January the 2nd, and the year, which was 1946, had scarcely commenced. Jeanette had operated a tobacco kiosk at the entrance to 97 York Street, between Market and King Street, Sydney, for more than 7 years. She usually closed up about 3 p.m. Her brother entered and found his sister. She was lying on her back on the floor in a pool of blood. The back of her head had been brutally bashed in. Some heavy instrument, thought to be an iron bar or a hammer, fracturing her skull, and an 18-inch length of clothesline was tied around her throat. Her glasses were broken. She had been dead for some hours when she was discovered. A blood-stained towel lay on the floor, and there were footprints in blood on the floor as well. The kiosk was tiny, about 2 feet wide at the street and 4 feet wide at the back door. The main 5-storey building was closed until the 7th of January, but a few tenants used the side entrance. Lewis Britton visited his sister at 12:15 p.m, and Teresa Mary Daly, who worked opposite the kiosk, saw Jean at 12:30, sitting in her booth. At 1:15, Robert Wayne Fullerton had stopped by for 5 or 10 minutes to chat with Jean and repay some money she had loaned him. A postman named Hatfield, who delivered letters to Mrs. Wicks, saw her in the afternoon, and she was in good spirits then. It was believed that the murder was premeditated and committed by someone who knew Jean. Robbery by someone who possibly owed her money was the prevailing theory. It was thought the killer sneaked into the kiosk while Jeanette was preoccupied with finishing up for the day, between 3 and 3:30. 2 men who had stopped at the kiosk to buy smokes at about 3:27 p.m. thought they heard the voices of a man and 2 women from inside the kiosk. Teresa Daly thought she heard 2 female screams at about 3:30, but thought it was some girls being silly. Rose Pizarro, working on the 2nd floor of 95 York Street, also thought she heard a woman yell, "No," 3 times and a door slam about 3:30, while Edna Thomas heard scuffling sounds. There had been a padlock with a bell attached to it on the door, but this went missing after the murder. Jean had put on her gloves to leave when the killer struck 2 fatal blows. Then, as she lay dying, the piece of rope was twisted tight around her neck to ensure that she was dead. Deep impressions were left where the rope garroted her. Bloodstains had splashed throughout the kiosk, and it was reasoned the killer may have been splattered by it. Police visited every dry cleaning business and laundry in the metropolitan area to check for anyone bringing in blood-drenched clothing to be cleaned. Jeanette had a large amount of money in the kiosk that day. She not only sold cigarettes, she had a profitable sideline in starting price bookmaking, taking bets by punters. She had branched into SP bookmaking in 1943, following the introduction of tobacco rationing during the Second World War. In fact, she ran an extensive operation. The slips showed she had laid bets of as much as £20 each way on races during the New Year's holiday. She had had a winning day at Randwick, the Sydney racecourse. It was thought she may have had £200 or more with her when she was killed, as Wednesdays were her settling day. Some gamblers had already collected their winnings that day, but others had not. It seemed the killer knew of this money, and that was the target of the crime. The takings from the wares sold at the kiosk didn't amount to much. About £5 in small notes and coins in tins and on shelves in the kiosk were left untouched. 15 men, whose names were on betting slips found by police, were questioned. All of them were able to prove their innocence, but none could shed light on the culprit. It was thought somebody who owed money may have carried out the deed. One man was spoken to by police who owed Jeanette £100, who was able to establish his innocence, but it further enforced how much money was passing through the little kiosk. Jeanette acted as both a principal and an agent in the SP bookmaking, which was illegal. Those who had not been paid had no claim against her estate because of that. The caretaker of a building nearby in York Street had placed bets with Mrs. Wicks for years, and found her to always pay promptly and to be scrupulously honest. He saw her paying out at about 11:30 a.m. on the day she died. Another man who worked in York Street said he had known her for 9 years, and that she was a shrewd businesswoman who was popular with everyone who had dealings with her. As police dug deeper, they discovered another of Jeanette's interests was with a big baccarat school that met nightly in a city arcade, and had a fleet of deluxe cars to drive the gamblers home after they played. She was known as the Jewess, and was a big bettor and a good punter, not afraid to take a risk, having won up to £500 in a single sitting of baccarat. Overall, it was thought she lost more than she won at cards, however. The school was raided by police 2 days before the murder, but it was some months since Jeanette is believed to have been there. Police had arrested 600 people for playing baccarat in the past 12 months, but Mrs. Wicks was not among them. Despite this image, her family said she usually sat at home in the evenings with her mother, knitting, listening to music, or studying shorthand. Jeanette had been born into a Jewish family in London in 1897. Having emigrated to Australia, she married Alan Wicks in 1926 and lived at Katoomba in the Blue Mountains, but had divorced after about 9 years. Her older brother was Alfred Britton, who was advertising director of the Brisbane Truth newspaper. She was buried in the Jewish section of Rookwood Cemetery on the 4th of January. By Saturday, the 5th of January, police were promising an early arrest, despite the case becoming ever more complex. Jeanette was found to have a lover, and then it was discovered that she had two, neither of whom knew about the other. On the 8th of January, police arrested a 26-year-old journalist named Douglas Ronald Morris and charged him with the murder. The next day he appeared in the magistrates' court, where he avowed he was innocent and was denied bail. It was claimed that a search of his Rose Bay home had uncovered a hammer and blood-stained clothing. On the 23rd of January, Morris was bailed for £1,000 on the proviso he reported to police twice a day, at 9 a.m. and 6 p.m. The next day Morris was remanded again, this time for being found with an unlicensed revolver at Rose Bay on the 3rd of January. This time his bail was only £20. Morris at first told police he had gone to the kiosk, but finding nobody there, had left. When blood-stained clothing was found in his possession, he altered his statement, and admitted he had entered the kiosk, and found Jean Wicks laying on the floor, and in attempting to assist her, his trousers and the cuff of his shirt had become stained with blood. At the inquest in February, Robert Fullerton, one of the alleged lovers of Jean Wicks, said he had known her since 1936, and they had been close prior to him enlisting in the army in 1940, but he insisted they were only friends, as did Major Richard Gadd, the second suspected paramour. Constance Verker gave evidence that she had spent an hour with Jean on the day Jean died. She observed two men hand over sums of money to Jean. She then said that Jean had phoned the offices of the Daily Mirror newspaper to speak to a man who worked there, who owed her money. At 2:30 a man named Colin Lawson called in to pay almost £200 which he owed. Mrs. Verker was still there at that time. Morris's statement was read out at the inquest. He claimed he had gone to the kiosk to pay Jean £103 he owed, but found her dead. He put his head to her chest to listen for a heartbeat, and his clothing and his hands became blood-stained. He wiped them on the towel which was left laying beside the body. He was going to go and fetch assistance, but realised that it looked bad for him, so he fled the scene in panic. Morris went home and took off his clothes, which he placed in a bag and concealed in the ceiling space. Morris had known Jean for 2 years. His mother owned the building where Jean lived, and she also lived nearby to Jean, and he had met her while visiting his mother, and he had also seen her at baccarat schools. He admitted that he had suggested to another man that she frequently held large sums of money at her kiosk and would be easy to rob. He had been placing bets with Jean for about a year. In all, he said he was in the kiosk for 30 seconds. After he left, he picked up his 2.5-year-old daughter from her great-grandmother's, and then a friend, and drove to Palm Beach, where he was holidaying with his family. Damning evidence was presented by Constable Clark of the Scientific Bureau. He had photographed 5 heel prints in blood and compared them to Morris's shoes. He said the heel of the left shoe had made the marks. He then produced 2 tent ropes taken from Morris's Palm Beach camp on the 3rd of January, which he compared to the rope found around Jean's neck. They were a match, he said. Morris's lawyer, Mr. Kincaid, asked the policeman to check again. Weren't the strands in the tent ropes different, he asked. The constable said the only difference was weathering in the tent ropes. Was one rope bigger? The constable admitted one was slightly, which he again blamed on weathering. He would not agree with the lawyer that one rope was of lesser quality than the other. Dr. Sheldon, giving evidence, said that although Jean had lost a lot of blood, she could have lived for days with the head wounds. She had died from strangulation. There was a surprise revelation during the inquest when it was revealed that a light was seen on in Jean's flat at about 8:30 on the night she was murdered. It transpired the police knew about it, and knew who had been in the flat. It was Richard Gadd, who said he had dropped by to visit Jean. At the conclusion of the 4-day-long inquest, the coroner said, "I find that Mrs. Jeanette Wicks died on January the 2nd in the Kiosk at York Street from strangulation caused by twisting a rope around the neck of the deceased at that place and on that date. I further find that Douglas Ronald Morris feloniously and maliciously murdered the deceased. I refuse bail." At the trial, which started on the 29th of April, Douglas Morris entered a plea of not guilty. Fingerprint expert Detective Alan Cleary gave evidence that he had checked the kiosk and Jean's handbag, but had found no fingerprints linked to the crime. The man who Douglas Morris was alleged to have spoken with about Jean being easy to rob, Joseph Morris, who was not related to Douglas, refuted the statement. The two had never discussed anything like that. He did not know Mrs. Wicks and had never been to her kiosk. Dr. Percy, who had examined the body with Dr. Sheldon, said that it would have been impossible for Jean to have screamed after being struck, as she would have lapsed immediately into unconsciousness, thereby putting the evidence of 3 women who said they heard screams into doubt. Morris's lawyer asked, "Who screamed? Was there another woman in the kiosk at the time of the murder?" Douglas Morris confessed in court that he had tried to mislead police about what he knew regarding the murder, and was genuinely shocked when they found the blood-stained clothing where he had secreted it. The question of the ropes was raised again by Morris's lawyer. He had a textile engineer, Carl Cripps, examine them. His expert opinion was that the ropes were dissimilar. The rope used to kill Jean was made of 4 strands, made up of 60 to 65 fibres, with 5 turns to the inch. The tent ropes were also 4-strand, but each strand composed of 85 to 95 fibres, and 6 turns to the inch. It was 1.5 times the diameter of the rope used in the crime. While the rope evidence frayed for the prosecution, the timing of the crime, which had been established by 3 reports of screams, was refuted by a beautician named Sylvia Cantrell. She had been at a salon giving manicures and selling cosmetics since the 15th of April. Before that, she worked as a commercial artist. She swore that she saw Douglas Morris in Reppin's Cafe on King Street at 3:30 p.m. She had promised to return home from shopping in the city at 4 p.m. Glancing at a clock and seeing the time, she decided she had just enough time for a cup of coffee. She had known Morris and his wife Phyllis for 8 years, and with her husband they had gone out together. He was just leaving as she sat down, and the two did not talk to each other, but she was certain of his identity. She had not come forward at the time of the inquest, as she was confused about who to give a statement to. She said, it was only after speaking to Morris's wife that she came forward. When she returned to work after taking the 2 days off to prepare and appear in court, she was sacked without explanation. Within 4 days she had been offered 4 new jobs. In summing up, the prosecutor said the blood got on Morris's clothes while he was kneeling down, strangling his victim. Her wallet, which contained the betting money, was then taken by Morris, whose gambling had gotten him ever deeper into debt. The case rested on circumstantial evidence, said the judge in his remarks to the jury. It was not for Morris to prove his innocence, but for the Crown to prove his guilt. The jury deliberated and announced that Douglas Morris was not guilty of the murder of Jean Wicks, The judge admonished Morris, hoping that he would not be guilty of any further acts of stupidity, as he released him. Morris thanked the judge and jury and walked out with his wife and mother. He vowed never to place another bet in his life before leaving Sydney to spend a quiet weekend in the country with his wife. His acquittal led to cheering and applause from the gallery, and crowds outside the court with yells of "Good on you, Morris" and "You beaut" being heard. A flood of congratulatory telegrams arrived for him. Morris wrote an article about his experiences, published in Brisbane Truth on the 12th of May, 1946. He said he had felt like he was in a nightmare. It seemed unreal, that it could not be happening to him. He acknowledged that his wealthy mother had been able to hire a top-notch lawyer, and that without him his case may have turned out very differently. Morris was scathing of Long Bay Jail, where he had been held awaiting trial, where he said the axiom of presumed innocent was in abeyance, and that men on remand were treated worse than those convicted, with monotonous food and petty regulations. The cell where he was kept was a haven for fleas and mosquitoes. One time the cells partially flooded, but no dry blankets were provided, or prisoners moved to dry cells. Morris said he bore no animosity towards the police, but criticised what he called their overzealousness. Although he believed the jury would find him not guilty throughout the trial, he nevertheless found himself pacing in his cell during their 50 minutes deliberation, and it was only then that the strain of the affair almost broke him. The murder kiosk became a popular attraction during the trial, with people approaching the new proprietress and asking if they could see where Mrs. Wick's body lay. So many knocked on the back door that she had to keep it locked. 2 other women had taken it on since the murder, only to quickly give it up and leave. Strangely, the kiosk acquired a reputation for being lucky. People who purchased lottery tickets there won amounts up to £1,000. One run of 15 tickets won prizes. Did Morris kill Jean and get away with it, with a plausible story of finding the body? Not if Miss Cantrell was correct that she saw him in the cafe at the time of the murder. Jean's ledger recording bets was missing after her death, and it was believed that it had been in her flat. Only one man admitted to being in the flat the night she died. Was Richard Gadd involved? Although her family tried to paint her as a homely woman, she was a big player in the SP betting world, which had links to organised crime. The baccarat games she attended were mostly run by colourful identities. Sidney Kelly, who died in 1948, was the baccarat king of Sydney. He had graduated from the razor wars fought between Melbourne gangsters Squizzy Taylor and Snowy Cutmore. In Melbourne, until his death in 1945, Henry Stokes, the successor to Squizzy Taylor at the top of the underworld, was given the same regal nickname. Could her association with shady characters have been her undoing? The murder was the first for 1946, when Sydney suffered a post-war crime wave in the following 12 months, with bashings, murders, armed robberies and sex attacks rife. Detective Ahern was murdered and 3 other police wounded in gunfights. A man with a Tommy gun held up and robbed a bus driver. An 11-year-old girl was outraged and killed in a cemetery, and her assailant never found. Was it just a random robbery, part of the upsurge in lawlessness in the city? The kiosk was robbed in May 1947 and £28 worth of tobacco and cigarettes taken. Nobody knows who was responsible for the death of Jean Wicks, for though police renewed their efforts after the acquittal of Morris, the murder remained unsolved. On the 27th of May, Douglas Morris was fined £15 for possessing the unlicensed revolver found by police in January. It was a souvenir from his time in the army. Morris died suddenly while cleaning his car in Ferber Road Centennial Park on the 25th of March 1956, leaving a widow, a baby daughter, and a son 14 and a daughter 12 from his previous marriage to Phyllis Morris. He was only 36 years old.